I'd like to start by just asking you, wherever you're located, to please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous people who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength in their spirit. I personally am sitting on the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee lands, and I'm very grateful for the care that they've taken and the access that they have generously allowed us to have. I am a fourth generation white settler, and I'm on a journey to learn more and become a better ally for Indigenous people. The webinar today is coming from our community of practice that's designed to address youth dating violence, that's funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. And we're very excited and absolutely thrilled to bring together this fabulous panel and to have a discussion around supporting sexual and gender diverse youth through trauma-informed care. Before I introduce the presenters today, I just want to go through a little bit of the format. So we've posted a link to all the presenters' slides in English, and you can find that in the chat box. And Stacy's already ahead of me. She is the magic wizard behind the screen that will make all the administrative things happen in this webinar extremely smooth. So thank you, Stacy, in advance. Today's webinar will run about 75 minutes, and we'd love it to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to ask questions along the way using the chat box, and we'll have about 20 minutes at the end to address your questions. And we will save those questions till the end of all of the presentations. At the end of the webinar in the chat box, we'll put an evaluation of today's webinar, and we really value the responses that people have provided us through these evaluations, and they've actually helped guide and shape our programming. So please know that your feedback is anonymous, and it's really important to us, and take the 2 minutes it takes to complete the survey. And once you complete the evaluation, you'll be directed to a website where you'll be prompted to enter your full name and email address, and then you can get a certificate of attendance that will be generated. I want to reassure you that your evaluation and your certificate of attendance are completely independent, and they are not linked in any way. I also want to let people know that today's webinar is being recorded so that we can share it with others who were unable to join us at this time. And we will send a link out to everyone that's registered, so you can also share it or listen to it again, because there's going to be great learnings and little bits you want to come back and think about. So now, probably for why you're here, I want to introduce, and it's a great pleasure and honor to have the presenters that we have today. Really, truly grateful for your presence and your contributions. Marisa van Bavel is a doctoral candidate in the school and applied child psychology program at the University of Calgary. Her research focuses on resilience among Indigenous youth. Marisa is a project research assistant with the Hope Lab, supporting projects related to school-based mental health, multicultural psychology, and social justice. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Marisa Fernandez Conde is a doctoral student in the School and Applied Child Psychology program at the University of Calgary. Her research focuses on understanding teacher stress, and she's a project research assistant at the Hope Lab, supporting projects that are focused on school-based mental health. Thank you for joining us. And Fae Johnstone is the executive director of Wisdom2Action, a social enterprise and consulting firm working with nonprofits and governments across Canada to advance 2S LGBTQ+ inclusion, improve mental health services, and combat gender-based violence. With a background in child and youth mental health sector and within the 2S LGBTQ+ community organizations, Fae's work centers on creating more inclusive, trauma-informed spaces for 2S LGBTQ+ youth. So thank you for joining us. Today, the webinar is going to be started with Marisa and Cristina that are starting. And so I'm going to turn it over to them, and then Fae will follow. So thanks, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hi everyone. It's so great to be here with you all today, and thank you so much for that introduction, Wendy. So yes, Cristina and I are very lucky to work with Dr. Dana Exner-Cortens in the Hope Lab and to have collaborated with PREVNet to put together the paper that informed our talk. So we just wanted to acknowledge the support that Dr. Exner-Cortens gave us, as well as Dr. Alyssa Marine, who provided a critical review of this paper. Cristina and I also wanted to start by just acknowledging that we are heterosexual, cisgender women, but as practitioners who work with youth, we felt that it was important for us to further educate ourselves on this topic in order to reduce the risk of harm and just to practice in ethical ways and to support the youth we work with. So this was a very eye-opening process for us, and we really enjoyed everything we learned putting this together, and we're excited to share it with you. So in our time together today, Cristina and I will talk about what trauma-informed care is, how it can be used with gender and sexually diverse youth, and we'll offer some considerations for practitioners moving forward.
Before we go into what trauma-informed care is with this population, we thought it was important to give you some definitions that could be helpful throughout this presentation. However, we will share a link at the end of this presentation that will take you to the document, which has a more like different definitions that will be helpful for you as you learn everything, well, as you start this process of learning about this. And first, I wanted to acknowledge that in Western culture, gender is often discussed as binary. So for example, we talk about male, female, boys, girls, and although gender is best described as a continuum that includes a range of identities, just like gender, sexual orientation exists on a spectrum, with some individuals identifying as heterosexual, that is, they attract to people of a different gender. Others identify as homosexual, so for example, gay and lesbian, where one is attracted to people of the same gender, and many falling somewhere in between, when they may be attracted to multiple genders, for example, being bisexual. And some individuals may use other terms to describe their sexuality. Such terms include queer, that is a broad spectrum of identities related to sex, gender, and attraction. Pansexual, which is attraction that is not dependent on the person's gender. And asexual, which is little to no sexual attraction or interest in sexual activity. Others may be questioning, which refers to uncertainty about attraction and or gender. And sexual orientation. Is highly personal. It is a multidimensional construct, which consists of identity, attraction, and behavior. And gender identity refers to one's internal experience of gender. And it is not fixed, and it may not align with one's sex assigned at birth. Attraction can present in many forms, including emotional, romantic, or sexual, or it may be absent. And behavior refers to one's sexual experiences with certain genders. These three components may be present in different forms. They may change over time, and they may not always be congruent, especially for youth. So why does this matter? In the last couple of weeks, we have witnessed how outspoken individuals in the United States have tried to change gender education at like very early stages of learning, kindergarten and elementary school. And elementary schools are banning discussions about sexual orientation and diversity in classrooms in Florida. And in Texas, politicians are trying to further restrict access to gender-affirming care for transgender youth. And these stances are concerning because they are not aligned with trauma-informed care practices or frameworks, and such discriminatory practices may help explain the fear that many 2S LGBTQIA+ youth have about seeking support from psychological or medical professionals.
So before we continue talking about what trauma-informed care is, we just wanted to provide a definition of what trauma is, as we know it can be a term commonly used in society, but it's good to have a common understanding of what we mean by trauma. So there are 3 E's that kind of encompass our definition that we're going to be using here of trauma, and it's often seen in trauma-informed care literature. So the first E is events. When someone experiences something, they give meaning to what happened. And the meaning that a person assigns to the event they've experienced is what determines whether or not it's traumatic. So people can be negatively impacted by events in different ways, but many people's experience of one event could result in trauma for some and not for others. So an event could be a single event, it could be a series of events, or an ongoing circumstance. For individuals that we're discussing, you know, perhaps it's coming out to close friends and they are not supported or accepted for who they are. That could be perceived as a traumatic experience. The second E is experience, which can be physically harmful experiences, emotionally harmful, or even life-threatening. And the third E of trauma is the effect that then results from these events and experiences. So the effects could be mental, physical, emotional, social, or effects to spiritual well-being. And the traumatic effect could be immediately felt, or it could be a delayed response. So with this understanding of trauma, let's talk about what trauma-informed care is. So this definition provided by SAMHSA states that when an approach is trauma-informed, it means that practitioners engage in actions that recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. These signs and symptoms could be things like disruptions to sleep or constantly replaying the event. We're also looking to explore paths for recovery, to encourage agency, so encouraging the youth's capacity to make choices that benefit them. We are respecting the individuals we work with and collaborating for their benefit.
Trauma-informed care is a framework with principles that consider trauma as part of the culture of the organization. And trauma-informed care can be used at the individual and organizational levels. And at the organizational level, it is important for trauma-informed care environments to incorporate the 4 R's. And these R's are realization, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. An important component when thinking about trauma is to understand that not every member of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community has been exposed to trauma, but it is important to identify it when it is there. So the realization means that staff realize the impact of trauma and its effects on 2S LGBTQIA+ youth. We recognize that it is not a matter of the individual having specific challenges or them being deficient, because sometimes that's the perspective that some people might have. Rather, there are social implications that make this population more vulnerable to trauma. And it is important for us to notice that impact. And then there's recognize. So staff recognize signs of trauma among 2S LGBTQIA+ youth, and they consider the impact of age, gender, context, and other intersecting identity factors. Staff also respond using trauma-informed principles, and they resist re-traumatization by creating environments that do not re-traumatize people. Staff are aware of the risks in the environment of re-traumatization and work to mitigate these risks. And this involves also listening to the population that we are serving. So how do we use the 4 R's with sexually and gender diverse youth? That is the main focus of the summary that we will share with you. So we'll go over every R so you can have some ideas and some of the implications for practitioners.
So starting with the first R of realize, as we talked about kind of in the definition of trauma, when we realize that trauma can impact people in a variety of different ways, physical, emotional, spiritual, so on, we can start to consider some practices to support. So the first point we wanted to address was understanding how secondary adversity can also impact gender and sexually diverse youth. And what I mean by secondary adversity is the emotional distress that can result from hearing about someone else's firsthand experience of trauma. So perhaps a youth is talking to a friend who sought services and was treated with disrespect, or it was a discriminatory environment. The youth could then have a secondary adversity where they're scared to seek support and services. So in recognizing the secondary adversity that comes, it just further reinforces the need to ensure all of our practices are trauma-informed and are supportive. In realizing the impact of trauma, we can then advocate for inclusive environments. So considering the organizations you work in, are there mission and vision statements that reflect inclusivity and care? Is there opportunities for staff to be educated on trauma, to be educated on the importance of an inclusive environment? Are there policies that reject discrimination against sexual and gender diverse youth? And then considering accessibility. So when we talk about accessibility, we're thinking geographically, program inclusivity, and facilities within the program space. So is the program accessible to youth who perhaps need to access services on their own or are scared to ask caregivers to take them there because they're not ready to come out yet? So is your program geographically accessible? Is there inclusivity in the program, whether that's, consent forms that allow them to put their name, that acknowledge the pronouns, and then facilities in the space. Are there gendered bathrooms, a list of resources? Those sorts of things are all important to consider. And then the second R is recognize. So some things we found in the literature in terms of recognizing the impact of trauma is to first support families to enhance 2S LGBTQIA+ acceptance. So practitioners can identify family dynamics that are either supportive and are helping the youth or are further contributing to a stressor for the youth. Negative family beliefs where a child feels rejected, doesn't feel heard, accepted, are obviously very damaging to the individual's self-esteem and comfort continuing to seek support and services. And these can continue to place youth at risk for harm. And as Cristina mentioned, we know just by virtue of individuals being sexually and gender diverse does not mean that they will experience trauma, but it's these types of environments that they exist in that may not be supportive that can further heighten the risk for harm. And so identifying family supports that can play a role in youth acceptance and mental health is key. And then providing ongoing training. And so training workshops could include crisis intervention, strength-based responses for working with youth, ways to engage youth and family.
Then the third R is respond. It is important to connect youth to supportive networks and groups. You might be unaware of some groups that can be supportive and can connect them to the community, for example, Gay Straight Alliances or GSAs if they're at school, or other different groups in the community. You can build trust by prioritizing physical and emotional safety. And given the likelihood that gender and sexually diverse youth have experienced trauma, they may require more opportunities for collaboration, choice, and control to feel empowered. So some tips for doing so include allowing youth to react without taking it personally, communicating in an open and non-judgmental manner, and providing choice in program preferences, goals, and form of contact. And emotional safety involves feeling protected, comforted, heard, and reassured. And to do this, you can use ally symbols or markers that indicate that youth that you're safe. So for many 2S LGBTQIA+ youth, trauma experiences have compromised their sense of safety and it needs to be restored. So displaying different banners or flags, books, or signs to show acceptance can be helpful for them to feel more comfortable. Another important component is that you should follow the youth's lead in conversations about gender and sexuality. So it is important for us not to assume as individuals and as organizations that gender and sexuality are relevant to the conversation just because the youth is a member of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. Further, we need to recognize that you might be working with sexually or gender diverse youth who has not disclosed it yet to close family members or just their community at large. And finally, given that trauma is a result of one's perception of an experience, it is important, as we mentioned earlier, to not assume that an individual has experienced trauma. And we need to create that space to actively listen to the youth story and interpretation of an experience. And this can be through our own individual programming. And it's even more meaningful if the organization also includes this in their policies, their workshops, and just having, considering what the needs of this population are. It is important for us to demonstrate respect when we respond as a trauma-informed care organization. And this is acknowledging that the youth's identity, it's important to recognize them, to maintain the youth's privacy, incorporate 2S LGBTQIA+ specific resources, and especially important is to hear from the community and whenever possible, partner with members of the community to learn more of their issues that are impacting them and are important for them. It is important to use inclusive language and honor pronouns. So using the youth's pronouns and tell them yours, and using inclusive language promotes safety in the environment. We also need to respond by shifting the conversation. So using a trauma-informed and friend-based approach by shifting the conversation from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. I think with working with a trauma-informed care approach, it is important to approach this component with curiosity and learn from the individuals we're working with rather than basing it off on our own assumptions and beliefs. In terms of resisting, it is important to foster self-awareness. So in any organization, staff should become aware of their personal assumptions, stereotypical beliefs, historical events that may impact views. We all have our own personal experiences with trauma. We all have our own vulnerabilities, and also understand our self-location within the context we are working in, as well as our organizations. And this awareness can help practitioners focus on the youth, as well as organizations, and engage in behaviors that build trust and avoid re-traumatization. Another way of resisting trauma is to keep learning. It is important for organizations to learn terminology and reliable information about different groups. So always remain open to learning and do not rely on youth to educate you. So find peers to consult with or debrief with and build relationships with the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. Providers should build awareness of relevant topics like 2S LGBTQIA+ vocabulary and definitions, identify development, specific traumas, or how prejudice, stigma, and discrimination impact mental health. Social and cultural diversity of the 2S LGBTQIA+ populations, historic and ongoing oppression, and how can we support them and be advocates for affirming and accepting environments. An important component of being an advocate is that we can create or foster environments where these youth feel accepted and welcome. And these environments can include schools, social groups, and supporting families to be more accepting. It is important to involve youth, given that the trauma-informed care involves collaboration, choice, and agency. We should consider developing an advisory board where staff can seek youth's input, and if not, organizations like Wisdom2Action who can provide input and support when you develop information or just like support in your community. And you can also, youth can offer suggestions for culturally competent practices, policies, and programs. And in the spirit of learning, it's also important to keep that open communication, especially as a practitioner myself. I think it's very important to acknowledge that it's always a learning process, and it is important to listen to the people that you're serving to be able to provide the best care we can. It is important to also consider trigger warnings. So if your organization runs workshops or offers different programming for youth, when discussing certain topics or sharing resources or asking you to share personal experiences, it is vital to provide content warnings to minimize the risk of re-traumatization. So inform youth that they can leave the room at any time if they feel uncomfortable, and encourage them to debrief as needed.
And we're just going to conclude by talking about the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. So in addition to the 4 R's that you can consider for making your programs and organizations more trauma-informed, there are 6 principles. So the first is safety, and this refers to physical or mental safety. So do youth feel safe in that you are using inclusive language, honoring pronouns, honoring their name choice? Trustworthiness and transparency is the second principle, and this refers to transparency in your decision-making, perhaps around treatment being provided or decision-making around what you share with their caregivers. The third principle is peer support. So recognizing that peer support is huge for youth and adolescents, and how can you continue to foster this in your organization? Perhaps it's Gay Straight alliances or encouraging youth to connect with each other in different ways. Collaboration and mutuality. Consider asking youth and their caregivers for feedback about what you're providing. See if there are things that can be changed or adapted in order to benefit them. Work at the youth's pace. Don't rush them to share information that are not ready to share with you. Empowerment, voice, and choice. Again, just recognizing it's important to always empower the individuals we're working with, to empower these youth, to foster resiliency, to see their strengths, and then to acknowledge cultural, historical, and gender issues. So this reminds us to always be checking our biases and stereotypes, and to consider, whether our programs, services are culturally sensitive. And so for more information about any of these, please see our paper and the references that we had used to gather this information. So here is a link to it. And again, just thank you to those that helped put this document together.
That's great. Thank you very much. We really appreciate that overview of the document, and I would encourage everybody to go and download that document to unpack many of the complex ideas and issues that were presented in the presentation, because it will really give that contextualize the information. So thank you both, Marisa and Cristina. I'm now going to turn it over to Fae.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wendy. And I'm just going to see if I can do this seamlessly and pull my screens up. Also, apologies. I definitely sent in a slide deck, and the one that was linked has an incorrect title slide. So please ignore that in the PDF. And just imagine you only ever saw this wonderful slide in front of you right now. So hi, everybody. My name is indeed Fae Johnstone. I use she and they pronouns. I'm the executive director of Wisdom2Action, and I've been doing 2S LGBTQ education, activism, and consulting for about 9 years. I have my BSW and MSW from Carleton University. And once I bite the bullet, I will also be a registered social worker, but I put it off for 2 years already. So who knows when that will actually happen. And Wisdom2Action is a consulting firm and social enterprise that, as Wendy mentioned, focuses a lot on 2S LGBTQ issues, mental health, GBV, and children's rights. You're welcome to check out our website, or of course, follow us on Twitter at wisdom2action.org, or well, at Wisdom2Action. In terms of my topic for today, I want to zero in and kind of start big and then get more specific in terms of practices for supporting 2S LGBTQ young folks. I always do also want to contextualize that I am joining this conversation from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory, colonially known as Ottawa, and that when we talk about 2S LGBTQ plus communities, we should also be just as intentional about the language that we use and the ways in which we decolonize the work that we do. Even when we talk about gender and sexuality, we often take issues and divide them into pretty little boxes, but lives don't fit into boxes, communities certainly don't either. And so when I think about 2S LGBTQ young folks, I think about young folks whose health and well-being is fundamentally shaped by social, political, and economic factors, and that the experiences of our young folks are very much a byproduct of systemic homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and other forms of oppression. Notably, again, colonialism is one of the most, prevalent, foundational forms of violence on this land. When we think about gender and sexuality, we have to recognize that even our way of thinking and talking about these issues is often colonial in nature, that we are only operating often through Western understandings of what gender or sexuality look like. And I would encourage us to challenge those notions even in these conversations, because if our spaces aren't safe and supportive for Two-Spirit and Indigenous, queer, and trans young folks, then we aren't doing justice to the communities that we are indeed here to serve. Now, these systemic factors have a wide range of impacts, as we all know. There is a lot of violence in this world, and quantifying it in a concise list is always a struggle. But some of the highlights are, of course, that due to systemic factors, we know that 2S LGBTQ young folks are more likely to be homeless or struggle with homelessness. We know that our young folks have very high rates of suicidal ideation, of depression and anxiety, that young folks from queer and trans communities are struggling to cope with isolation, particularly if you imagine during COVID-19, the last 2 years, my heart and my mind hasn't been able to move beyond that 16-year-old who's at home and isn't safe to come out, who isn't able to access online spaces, maybe because their parents are always looking over their shoulder, and who may have been cut off from their high school GSA, which prior to COVID may have been like the only place that young person could go to feel safe, to be gendered correctly, to be allowed to put on a binder or to use a different name. And so I really want to ground us in that I think we often think of 2S LGBTQ issues as a thing from 5 years ago or a decade ago, but our young folks still aren't doing all right. And it's not because of them, it's because of a broader world around them that continues to enact violence in a variety of ways. Now, on the topic of 2S LGBTQ young folks and gender-based violence or violence writ large, what do we know? We don't have as much data as we might like in terms of prevalence or in terms of impact. But we know that violence is common. We know that 84% of trans people have avoided at least one public space due to fears of harassment and discrimination. That means folks are intentionally, not going to the convenience store, not going to the park, not going to the local public facility because they're worried about using the bathroom there, or they're worried about what will happen if they have to go out late and come home, and if they'll be able to get home safely. We know that 64% of trans and non-binary young folks have experienced sexual harassment. That is particularly true for racialized and Black and Indigenous young trans and non-binary folks, and particularly those who may be more visibly gender non-conforming. We know that 34% of young folks have experienced physical sexual harassment, and 63% have experienced physical or sexual assault when it comes to bisexual girls or women. And so we know that prevalence is a problem, and we in community know that these are crises. I think Marisa and Cristina alluded very well to the idea that, not every 2S LGBT person is a survivor of trauma, but that it actually takes on a mind of its own in community. So we all know people who are survivors of trauma. In my own work, I spend a lot of time talking to queer and trans young folks and the folks who work with them. And I can even, the concept of vicarious trauma has never rung as true to me as the last 5 years in this sector. And so even if individuals are doing okay, they are also in communities that generally aren't. And that in and of itself has an impact on your mental health. When you know that even if you're doing okay, maybe your sibling isn't, maybe if you're doing okay, it might not always be that way. And that foundationally is one of the realities in this world that we need to address, so that we do know that every queer and trans kid can be okay, and that most of them are. Now, in terms of where GBV and 2S LGBTQ identities intersect, our team had the pleasure of looking at this issue through a project funded by Public Health Agency of Canada. And the 5 buckets you see on your screen capture some of the most frequently identified issues. And this was not quantitative research. This is very much community-based generative conversations with young folks in focus groups, surveys, and key informant interviews. They spoke to experiences of sexual harassment and street harassment, that feeling of always looking over your shoulder and not knowing what's going to happen next. Not that, harassment is every day, but it's frequent enough that it's a possibility. Violence in schools, unsafe family contexts, experiences of intimate partner violence, including struggles with service providers being able to recognize instances of intimate partner violence in 2S LGBTQ contexts, because again, a lot of the time our frame of reference in and of itself speaks to the needs of cisgender and heterosexual young folks. And negative perceptions. So of course, that world where, negative news about 2S LGBTQ people is ever present. My mind is on Texas right now in Florida, and what we're seeing in terms of targeted attacks on the rights of trans children and trans young people. And so those stories as not a new thing, but a common thing, those also perpetuate a world in which, again, these young folks don't see a happy future for themselves when they should be able to and could be able to. I also, of course, want to name that GBV trauma is not a single frame or a single story, that these experiences are compounded and in fact look differently within different subsections of identity. So not only are the rates of violence higher for example, a racialized trans person compared to a white cis person or a white trans person, the ways in which violence takes shape will change too. Family violence will not look the same in different contexts. The kinds of harassment or public gender-based violence you'll experience will shift quite foundationally. I am a 26-year-old trans girl. My partner is a 25-year-old trans man. We have 2 completely different experiences in public space. I get a lot more disgust and shame. My partner gets a lot more oh, you look kind of strange. I don't understand what's going on here. And so one of the challenges for providers is to take a look a little bit deeper and to acknowledge and recognize that your conception of what gender-based violence looks like, your imagination of a queer or trans young person's experience in public space or in intimate partner violence, may actually be quite different from that young person's actual experience thereof, based both along all of the factors you see on your screen, and also just like where they're at, if they're in a rural town, if they're in Ottawa versus Toronto. Communities are different and complicated. Now, in terms of what we can do about this, in terms of how we support 2SLGBTQ young folks impacted by GBV and other forms of violence, creating inclusive environments, as Marisa and Cristina alluded to, is absolutely the first step. That includes trying to avoid spaces that feel super medical or clinical or institutional. I love when there's like stuffed animals hanging out in a waiting room. I think that if I can like cuddle with a stuffed animal in a post-COVID world before I want to see a therapist, like A+, I'm already in a good mood. And so creating comfortable spaces and spaces that are also accessible, that also aren't screaming at you. We know that our communities have a lot of autistic young folks in them, and there are often like other accessibility features such as like noise overload that can act as barriers to accessing space. Also reflecting on partnerships. I think it's a hard truth that many of us have different relationships to institutions and to different kinds of organizations. And so being clear about the parameters of safety and privacy and confidentiality for young folks you're interacting with is absolutely crucial. A lot of the 2SLGBTQ young folks I know will go to the informal spaces rather than the clinical spaces because they don't want to have to fill in a 17-page intake, and they also don't want to have a conversation about their trauma. They want to just be able to hang out with a bunch of other young folks and like eat some bad pizza. Lastly, interpersonal safety, so using inclusive language. And I think the humility piece here is really integral to me. I do a lot of work educating straight and cisgender folks on 2SLGBTQ identities. And my biggest message is like, you don't need to memorize all of the words. You don't need to know every single gender identity. I still don't. And you don't need to have a textbook perfect definition for every gender or trans experience. You need to understand the concepts, and you need to move forward with humility and with some good practices. And with those basics, you're gonna be okay. Trans folks and 2SLGBTQ young folks are not like some weird, complicated new set of people. We've always been serving these folks. We just haven't always done it well. Doing it well starts with unpacking our bias, changing our practice, and that's where good things can happen. Now, I am gonna largely skip over this slide because I think Cristina and Marisa did a much better job of speaking and walking through trauma-informed care than I ever would have or could have. But again, it's all about recognizing in 2SLGBTQ communities in particular, trauma takes on a life of its own. Again, it also is shifted when it's not just individual, but community experiences thereof. And so all of us are coming into spaces where trauma is present and are being exposed to trauma or traumatic stories or events on a regular basis. And so we also need to make space with that in mind for strength-based and positive narratives. I often joke that my job is to make everyone depressed about 2SLGBTQ issues. My job is not the like, here is the bright, shiny, incredible story. But there are so many of those stories. There are queer and trans folks living and thriving. Celebrating those stories in and of itself creates an impression of a better tomorrow for queer and trans young folks. And that is a narrative that needs to be fully implemented and shared. Now, in terms of other pieces, I know this isn't new, but I always like to stress the importance of safety planning when working with 2SLGBTQ young folks. A lot of trans folks in particular, trans girls and trans femme young folks, Black and Indigenous and racialized trans young folks, our safety in public is always dubious. And so that does mean that we should work with these young folks to help them be safe in public space. That can include, identifying the safe stores that you can step into on your walk home. That can include organizational changes like, hey, can we send these folks home in a cab or wait with them at the bus stop? But it can also include working with young folks to help them identify how to cope with experiences of violence, what to do if things go bad or get dangerous, and how to de-escalate, in particular if they are on their own. We also, I would say, I am less reliant on the concept of bystander intervention while also being a big fan thereof, largely because I think a lot of violence against trans young people is ignored and that is never addressed. I think a lot of people will stand silent as trans people are harassed and otherwise assaulted. And so I think we do have to build the competency in young folks to get themselves out of trouble in the best ways and safest ways that we can. And then lastly, I think coping strategies are integral. It is not simply enough to change our own practices, and we don't want to place the burden on these young folks. But at this point in time, a lot of these youth get messages and get harassed on a recurring basis. There is a high risk of internalizing those narratives, of believing that you deserve it, of believing that it is justified. We need to support young folks to cope with those experiences through a variety of outlets. My go-to is my partner and like late night Twitter threads where I'm like kind of losing my train of thought, but it's working. And so we all can work with young folks to help them find the outlets for the hurt and the harm, and to find the outlets as well for the rage and the anger. Because if you don't find outlets for all of the above, they will stew, and that is not good for my mental health. That won't be good for their mental health. And as their clinician or social worker or peer worker, I guarantee it won't be fun for you either. So helping identify self-care strategies and coping mechanisms is absolutely essential. Now, to finish, many 2S LGBTQ+ young folks experience near daily violence and discrimination. Again, this becomes a new normal. I never would have imagined, and I'm 26, and Lord, the moment that you come out, and particularly as trans, your experience in public space shifts quite fundamentally. And we need to remind ourselves and these young folks that this violence is not on them, and that it is not a failing of them as individuals. And so as providers, we can squarely place the blame where it belongs, on systems and structures, and sometimes, yes, on that man who wouldn't leave you alone when you were walking home. You can yell about that man as long as he's not on the street anywhere nearby. You can provide support and tools for planning and safety, so safety planning, coping mechanisms. And more than anything else, as a provider, you can advocate for safer places and more inclusive practices. And I would encourage you to imagine that not just in your own little bubble, but in your organization. I want a world where we have broad and inclusive and 2S LGBTQ inclusive interventions for everybody, but we equally need targeted interventions specifically curtailed and designed with 2S LGBTQ young folks, because our communities have unique and distinct needs. And so we need a nice little blend of both worlds, and we need providers who are champions for those interventions. With that, thank you very much. I think I have used my 20 minutes, and Wendy, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, well, thank you. And as always, Faye, every time I see you, I learn something new, and I feed off your enthusiasm and your passion and your dedication. So thank you for that. I'd like to open it up. We've been monitoring the chat. We have not seen a question yet, so don't be shy. We've tried to create a safe space for you. If you have a question, please feel free to put it into the chat. I'm going to start because I have many questions, so I'll just try and get them all warmed up. My first one is really thinking about that systemic issue. Like I always find that there's this sort of paradox that we have to create these safe spaces and understand that this is a systemic issue, and that we're also putting some pressure on the youth themselves to learn coping strategies and make safety plans. So how do we do better, to create those safe spaces and take a more systemic perspective? What are the things that we could do to do that? Any ideas?
I have some ideas, but I don't know if Faye wants to go first, because I think it would be great to hear that. I feel that it's difficult to change like the macro system, like that huge system. If we think about the example of Florida or Texas, which have been in my mind for the last couple of weeks, and the implications that laws have in our everyday lives, I think that one way is to advocate for those changes, making sure that you support politicians who are supportive of this community and making sure that their policies align with trauma-informed care. I am a registered provisional psychologist in Alberta, and I think that I would be terrified to be practicing in Florida or Texas because it goes against any ethical code. I see Faye nodding. It would be almost impossible to practice in a way that is ethical and consistent with best practices and evidence-based practice to do this. So just making sure that the communities we're supporting, the politicians we're supporting, are actually pushing an agenda that is open for everyone and understands the different needs within these very diverse population. But to start with, I think we can really focus on our own groups or cultures. So for example, me, I work in schools most of the time. So making sure that the schools I work with understand the importance of being trauma informed, being able to be open to their students, being open to families who are also part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, making sure that the families feel welcomed, that they know that it is an open and inclusive environment, and supporting staff as well. And I know it might seem small, but I think it's important for us as practitioners to advocate within our own context and making sure that we're partnering with groups that are able to support us and guide us through what trauma-informed care would look like in these type of organizations.
Okay, great, thank you. Faye, did you want to add?
I think Cristina hit the nail on the head. One piece that I would add is don't only think about 2S LGBTQ inclusion because it's like you want to build your team's knowledge and capacity and put out a nice tweet or a statement. I would also think fundamentally, how does 2S LGBTQ inclusion speak to your mandate? How is it already within your mandate? Are you articulating that? I don't want, there is no cookie cutter approach. There is no one size fits all model, but organizations really need to look at their mandate, their mission, their values, and see how trans and 2S LGBTQ inclusion filters through all of that. The other piece is that this work shouldn't be done in isolation. And so building relationships with local 2S LGBTQ organizations is absolutely essential. They will build trust. They will help you figure out the small stuff that could become problems, including dead naming or difficulty with pronouns. They will help y'all with that. But they often aren't invited into the room. And so my first step in terms of combating systemic homophobia and transphobia is treat our organizations as the credible stakeholders that they are and bring them into your conversations, onto your tables, into your meetings, and then work with them and try to respond to them. If there is a crisis happening locally, see what they're doing and saying about it. And then think about what you can offer to these organizations. A lot of the time it's how can you help us? And we don't realize that a lot of our organizations that feel like they're the small fish in a big sea are actually a kind of big fish. And that we have some things to offer in terms of organizational capacity, grant writing, fundraising, communications, evidence-based practice. Queer and trans organizations have never been resourced to do that work as well as they could. And so other orgs can bring that expertise to bear, and that is mutually beneficial like nobody's business.
Okay, great. I have a question from the chat for Faye. I work on a university campus. If I wanted to indicate to trans plus students that our space is a place they can come if they need a place to go, what is the best way to do that?
Yeah, I love that. I think one step would be check in, almost every campus has a gender and sexuality resource center or a space like that. Chat with them and just get to know their people, and they will send their people to you. And then secondly, nothing, you can literally throw up a poster, a little, if you have a washroom nearby, put a gender neutral sign on it. That always brings the people. But put a little trans pride sticker up somewhere, add pronouns to your name tags, or put a little poster in your intake room that says, you can share your pronouns if you're cozy doing so. And those small shifts to physical environment are an invitation to queer and trans young folks that they can be their full and authentic selves in those spaces.
Okay, anyone else want to add to that? Okay, I have another question. What advice would you give to parents of a beautiful trans daughter who had difficult accessing proper health care through the regular family physician for her transition?
I feel like I can answer this one. So I would say one thing is I am so sorry for the negative experience through a regular family physician. That is all too common. And second thing is I think that's a great thing to yell at an MPP about or another parliamentarian. And by yell, I mean send a nicely worded email. At the end of the day, there is not a lot that we can do in our OHIP structure in terms of improving competence in physicians and ensuring that all physicians are well equipped to support trans and gender diverse folks. And so it is a government issue. It is a public policy issue. You can also send that position to Rainbow Health Ontario if they need to build their knowledge, and they can give training if there is interest in such. But my advice to you as the parent would be just keep being there for your daughter, coming to bat for her, and like be there with her when it sucks and when things don't go well, and be with her to celebrate when things do go well. Having a champion and ally makes or breaks the experience. So she is lucky to have you.
Okay. Anyone else want to add to that?
They gave such a great answer to that. I don't have much more to add. I was trying to think of organizations in the community that could be reached out to in terms of support and in terms of asking like what care they received and what doctor was perhaps accessed that was supportive in that area. And so like happy to, if I come across or know of individuals who have a really good understanding of care. I'm not sure if you're in Alberta, but can pass that along because it's so important to just have those communities of support and know where is a safe place to go.
Okay. Okay, so someone has to leave. So there's thanking you for doing an enlightening introduction to trauma-informed care. And both people have thanked you for answering their questions. Just also, Rebecca noted that one of the physicians in Sioux Lookout in Ontario runs a weekly clinic that assesses trans girls and trans boys in their transition. So may there be more of those that come and may each of us leave thinking we need to do more to advocate on this. Sorry. Okay. Did any of the panelists have questions that they wanted to ask? Their just responses to each other's presentations that we.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm so bad at coming up with questions, as I feel like our audience can also appreciate right now.
Or that you've reflected upon after listening. Yeah,
I think
go.
Oh, sorry, Wendy. I think I was thinking about some of the things that Faye shared about not only thinking what organizations in the community can do for us, like as organizations who might not, or as an individual who might be cisgender or who's not part of the community. I was just thinking, what would be the best way to reach out to these groups? Or do you have any, I don't know, tips on how, as practitioners or organizations, how can we partner with these 2S LGBTQ plus groups?
I love it. I think honestly, it's scary to think about, but it's usually just like flip them an email. Like, I think if you don't know where your local org is, the Enchanté network is a national umbrella of over, I think, 200 now, 2S LGBTQ organizations. They break it down by province, so you can go and creep. But I think it really is just that start with, hey, I am a 2S LGBTQ inclusive blank. I work with blank. We'd really love to find ways to help support your work. I don't know if you could, like, you know, we're happy to have clients referred to us. Like, even that offer, like a lot of these orgs struggle. They have young folks who are always coming in with needs that they just aren't able to meet. And so if you work in a public context, or if you're like, your costs are publicly covered, I think engaging and having that conversation is phenomenal. Even if you're a private practitioner, like, have that conversation, because these orgs need that list of folks they can send to which places, when, and for who. And so I would always recommend just like, yeah, a little email and have a phone call and just chat. I think they'll want to vet you and be like, okay, you're good, we can trust you, you're not going to say anything strange to our youth. And like, I think we have to do a little bit of our like due diligence there, because you'd be surprised. But go into those conversations and you'll learn a lot through it and build a relationship too.
Thank you.
Okay. Wondering if you happen to know of any good resources for learning more on how to help support queer and trans youth with ASD specifically.
Oh Lord, I wish I had a better question or a better answer for that. I would say start by like, so my partner is like autistic, and so like I live in a like very neurodiverse household and world, and I always struggle with the like, how do we, like, the way that we talk about it is very clinical in our youth sector, and my biggest thing is just like, let people be people, and like people will have quirks that you don't understand that look different to you, and like let that be what it is. But I think generally there are not many resources for queer and trans young folks who are autistic or who have ASD. I think that it's a place where there isn't much. What I'd recommend is helping them find the books that are by and for their own identities that can speak to that experience. I think that is usually the best option, because a lot of young folks are left, like they don't see stories of autistic 2S LGBTQ youth. And so doing some diving in is always a good plan.
Okay, and I note someone has put a link in the chat to a great resource for that, which is www.autismspectask.org. So that's a really great one that everybody could use if they wanted to. I'm conscious of time, but I'm just wondering, I think this has just been such a valuable conversation. And one of the things is I feel like there's been a lot of like, conceptually, this is how we create a trauma-informed approach. And I really would like to get to some concrete strategies, like, so, one of the things we've talked a bit about was physical environment. But I'm wondering if you could just each take a moment to say, here's two strategies that you can engage in today that would, support a trauma-informed approach. I don't know who wants to go first. Don't you love it when people throw out questions like that? Marisa, you unclicked first, so I'm going to you.
I see we all unclicked. No, I love that question. I would say the first thing to do is reflect on your own biases and perceptions of individuals within this community. And I know that's a big one to ask. It's hard to sit back and reflect, but even taking 5 minutes to think about it. And then the next is to share your pronouns, whether that's in meetings or people you meet. It can be a great way to bridge that conversation and just show respect and alliance with the community.
Okay, can I just follow up on that? Because I find like reflect and self-awareness a really big bucket to unpack. Because I have the same thing in terms of thinking about language. And so how does one start that process of reflecting and trying to become more self-aware? Like, and I'll open it up so you won't still be on the
share.
It is like a hard, like I spend so much time being like, think about your gender and sexuality, and like, but actually, like, I mean, like, start with yourself, right? Like, we think of gender as this like thing that's all around us, but think about how gender has shaped you. How has your personality been changed or molded because of your gendered upbringing? And that's true for everybody, right? And if you actually start with that, like, again, I think for young boys, like, think about the messaging that you were told, that you boys will be boys, that you have to be strong and tough. Think about the fact that a lot of young boys would bully other boys so that they wouldn't look weak. And then start there and trace how that came to be you today. And that's not in a good or a bad way, but that process, it actually does begin with our own accounting of how gender and sexuality have shaped us. And then like poke weird holes in it. Like what I love to do is tell people that like the color pink and blue used to mean the opposite. And so find those weird anomalies and like dig into them a little bit. And just do some of those, like, I don't want to send people on like a sociology dissertation, please Lord. But it really is to start recognize that there is no single universal experience of gender or sexuality, that this thing means and looks different in different countries at different points in different times. The word homosexual is less than 200 years old. The word heterosexual first meant hypersexual attraction, morbid sexual attraction to members of the opposite sex. Everything is fake, everything is changing. Start with that, and just like, it allows you to see so much more of people and so much more of yourself. If you unpack your own relationship to gender and sexuality, you can better control and have agency over your own life and identity.
And I wanted to add to that, in the resource that we created, there are some resources or guides that you can go through. We try to cover many different groups within the 2S LGBTQI+ community. But I find that if you're not able to join groups in your community or discussions, sometimes reading these documents can make you think about your own biases and the lack of knowledge that you might have of a specific component. We've said that we shouldn't put these on the youth we're working with. It's also our responsibility to learn and be informed. There are some wonderful community organizations that have documentaries and discussions, and they have different community members come in and speak to their experiences. And I find that listening to those many different perspectives and experiences can also help you understand what people in other who identify differently to you, what they have experienced and some of the challenges they go through. I feel we tend to assume that we understand those challenges, especially as practitioners or as organizations, and we start developing a blind side. And I think it's important to join these discussions, be challenged in your own beliefs, not just from your own perspective, but also listening from other community members. And I find that it's just being this openness to learn. And it can even start from like a good documentary that someone can recommend. There are some great discussions and chats in websites like the Trevor Project, who can also, that can also help you navigate some of these components of reflecting on your own biases and perceptions.
Great, thank you, Cristina. All right, I have not forgotten. I did have a question before I unpack that one. So going back to the two pieces of information. I don't know who, Faye, you unclicked, so I'm going to go to you next.
It was on, it was two pieces of information around like first steps around like trauma-informed care, right? Yes, okay. Oh Lord, First one, I think Cristina somebody already said the pronouns piece. This is good. So I think, first step would be, actually, if you're going to do something after this session, there is the MMIWG supplemental report on 2S LGBTQ people. Read that. Actually, just read that. It's a comprehensive look at gender and sexuality and colonialism, and start there. Actually, on all of this, we were talking about learning about our own gender. Start with learning about gender and colonialism, because that does help. And then the second thing is, honestly, the next time you see a trans person being harassed in public space, the next time you see someone being misgendered, step in, just do it. Just say something. You don't have to have all the answers, but notice that moment, make eye contact with that person. It really does have to begin with when people are under assault, when people are targeted, when people are mistreated. It's on each and every one of us to step in. No amount of training will make you feel confident doing it. You just have to take that step and work with it from there.
And I'm going to just add to that. I'm using my prerogative as the moderator, is, coupling it with what Marisa said, be aware of those moments. Because I also think that as we walk along the streets, as a cis woman, I may not be as aware of those when they happen. So I guess the first thing about being self-aware is also being other aware and noticing those so that you can step in.
I just want to add on to what Faye had said, because I was recently doing a bunch of research and talking to adolescents about bullying, and a lot of feedback I got was that it was scary to think about stepping in and supporting the individual you're seeing being harassed. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about that there's so much literature out there that says when you step in and you either tell the person to stop or you do make eye contact with the person experiencing and pulling it away, that the situation will dissolve. You're not likely to be targeted back, and it does do a world of support, and it can stop the incident within a matter of 10 seconds. And so just know that, what you're doing really does make a difference.
Okay, great. And just for everybody, I note that Faye has put your reading in your next step in the chat. So please click on that and leave your window open so that you'll know you can read that and take that first step. Cristina, I'm going to go to you for your two.
Sure. I think markers are very important. Maybe just having, if you have a name tag or anything, having a small pin with different flags, or just letting people you work with that you're an ally and that you're there to support them, I think can be important. And most of all, I think it's rather than support, it's just learning and being open to that having conversations and just finding ways to connect these youth. And then what else? I think if you work in an organization that has different forms, maybe looking over them, I think that's something that you could do today, and maybe look at how inclusive they are. Not only from 2S LGBTQ plus perspective, but how are you asking questions? Is it really necessary to have boxes when you ask for gender? Could you just do it open-ended so that people can just write down these sort of thing, like their identity? I think that would be more inclusive. It's something that would take you a couple minutes, and hopefully long-term you could advocate for your organization to change forms. Or if it's your private practice, it's a good day to just change those little details to make things more inclusive.
Okay, great. Anyone want to add to that? No. I see that we are nearing the end of our time and there are no more questions that have come. Just doing my final check. Does anybody want to have a closing comment or something that they really wish they had said, and they now have the moment to say it? Just unclick if you do.
I mean, okay, so I'm promoting a training, so I'm just going to promo my training real quick. So we're doing a 3-year project funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada. It includes training on GBV and 2S LGBTQ youth. The next series, it's all free, it's all virtual. The next series will be focused on youth serving organizations. If you want to dive deep into GBV and 2S LGBTQ youth intervention, prevention, etc., check it out at saferproject.org. I'll drop the link in the chat. .ca, saferproject.ca. I always mess that part up.
I think that would be great. That is actually good for everybody. So thanks for doing that. Marisa or Cristina, do you want a final word or are you good?
Don't have anything else to add, but it was just great being on the panel with you all, and I learned so much from you, Fae. So I'm glad we got to do this together.
I agree. Thank you so much for sharing, Fae.
Thank you both for sharing. This was phenomenal. So I feel honored to have been here and to have listened to you.
And I want to thank all of you for being here and sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your experience, and also putting up with my questions. So really value each of what you gave to us today. And we certainly have something that we can all walk away with. And starting today, do 1 or 2 things differently to create that trauma-informed, safe space for all. I'd like to remind you that there's a link in the chat for you to feel free to fill out that evaluation of today. I'd like to do a special thank you to Stacy, who has been working the chat and also been ensuring that this runs smoothly. So thank you, Stacy. And thank all of you who have taken the time out of your day to attend. And I think that's the first step. That's the first step in creating the safe spaces. It's the first step in beginning to make a difference. It's the first step in helping us become more aware so that we can be more effective in supporting the youth that we serve. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day. Bye.